So let's now go on to our second and last speaker of the panel, Louward Allen Zubiri from the Mangyan Heritage Center, who's going to be speaking about developing materials for endangered indigenous scripts in the Philippines, lessons from Mindoro. Louward, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm currently screen sharing right now. Okay.
Okay. Great. Great. Looks promising.
Good day. I'll be talking about developing materials for endangered indigenous scripts in the Philippines, lessons from Mindoro. My name is Louward Allen Zubiri, and I'm the head researcher of the Mangyan Heritage Center. I'll start by providing some context with regards to the language policy and planning in the Philippines. In 1997, the Philippines has enacted the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, giving several cultural and linguistic rights to indigenous peoples of the country. More than a decade after, the Department of Education enacted Order Number 74, Series of 2009, which institutionalized mother tongue-based multilingual education, stating that the mother tongue is indeed the best medium of instruction for children. 2 years after, the Department of Education released Order Number 62, Series of 2011, which adopted the National Indigenous Peoples Education Policy Framework, starting the whole different program of Indigenous Peoples Education. In 2015, the Department of Education released Order Number 32, which adopted the Indigenous Peoples Education Curriculum Framework. And just last year, the Commission of Higher Education released Memorandum Order Number 2 that integrates Indigenous People Studies into relevant higher education curricula. So looking at this, we can see that there are actually several language policies promoting and advocating the linguistic rights and cultural rights of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines. Looking further into details, the language ecology of the Philippines is as such. It has two official languages, Filipino and English, 19 official languages of instruction under the mother tongue-based multilingual education program, which includes these languages: Tagalog, Kapampangan, Pangasinan, Ilocano, Bicol, Ibanag, Bisaya, Hiligaynon, Waray, Bahasa Sug, Maguindanaon, Maranao, Chavacano, Ivatan, Sambal, Akyanon, Yakan, Kinaraya, and Surigao. The remaining languages of the 180 plus languages of the Philippines now then falls under Indigenous Education Program. We'll zone into the island of Mindoro, found in the central Philippines. It is the seventh largest island in the Philippines and has been characterized to have a mountainous interior, providing enough reason for language speciation. Mindoro is known to be the ancestral domain of the Mangyans. Mangyan is used commonly as an umbrella term for 8 different ethno-linguistic groups. These groups are Alangan, Bangon, Buhid, Hanunuo, Iraya, Ratagnon, Tadjawan, and Taubuhid. Linguistically speaking, these 8 different ethno-linguistic groups belong to different branches, one of which is Northern Mangyan, the other is Southern Mangyan, and the remaining Kuyan branch belongs to the bigger Visayan group of languages. So even from the point of view of linguistic subgrouping, the different ethno-linguistic groups in Mindoro is not homogeneous. We'll focus on two of the Mangyan groups, Buhid and Hanunowo, because these two have and use their own indigenous scripts. So among the standardized and recognized indigenous scripts of the Philippines, Surat Hanunowo Mangyan and Surat Buhid Mangyan, with their respective ISO 15924 codes, Hano and DOHD, refers to the alpha-syllabic or Abugida scripts of these two ethnolinguistic groups. ISO 15924 refers to the international standard for the codes of script names. As you can see from these two descriptions and the two characterizations here, Surat Hanunowo Mangyan and Surat Buhid Mangyan are more angular in shape compared to other related indigenous scripts in the Philippines, such as Baybayin, Surat Tagbanwa, and Surat Palawan. The reason for this angular shape is that Surat Hanunowo Mangyan and Surat Buhid Mangyan are written on bamboo slabs or on bamboo cylinders. So going back to the map of Mindoro, we'll see that Hanunowo and Buhid are actually located in the southern part of the island. Further zooming in that area, we can see that there are 7 different towns covering areas that are Buhid and Hanunowo. For this particular study, we have surveyed all those 7 towns. One of the main goals of this project is to advocate for research by the communities itself. We tried to incorporate the concepts of inclusion, representation, participation, and decision making by the community themselves. As much as possible, we have tried to maximize the incorporation of these concepts in our methodologies. So for this particular case, you can see that as much as possible, we have tried to cover almost all barangays, which is a smaller administrative unit lower than a municipality, to be included in the project. So here at the map, you'll see green areas are under the Hanunuo communities, while the orange areas or the red areas are Buhid communities. Not only are the communities involved, but even the indigenous people structures, the recognized governing body of the indigenous peoples in this area. We have collaborated and consulted with 3 of them, Sadikabanan Buhid, the People's Organization of the Buhid Community in Oriental Mindoro, Hagura, the People's Organization of the Hanunuo Community in Occidental Mindoro, and FADAG, the People's Organization of the Hanunuo Community in Oriental Mindoro. These 3 organizations are partners throughout this whole project. This project is a longitudinal one. It's a 5-year project, involves 3 main phases: documentation, a script and script variety, developing materials based on the output of those documentation, and eventually teaching the script using the materials that were developed. The project actually started due to the request of the communities to address the continuing endangerment of the scripts in Mindoro. Just a quick overview. For the documentation phase, we started doing participatory methods. From the identification of the field researchers who will be part of the field team, this is determined through continuous community meetings and assemblies and with consultation with the people organization. And then we have incorporated capacity building activities to help instill the necessary documentation skills and field methods skills to the chosen members of the communities. And then through further consultations, we have identified sites and culture bearers and elders who would be willing to participate in the project. All the instruments, questionnaires, survey forms, consent forms, and assent forms were pre-tested and then validated. And all of those processes and activities were done before the documentation proper, which is actually documenting the different instances of script use and script forms. And after everything, the results are always being validated. So here we'll look briefly at a sample video of a documentation of how an elder writes surat Hanuno Mangyan in this bamboo cylinder called luka. So it is only after the whole process of documentation concludes that we will start with materials development. And the onset of materials development is the validation of the output of documentation. So we have conducted this with the monthly regular meetings of the different people's organization across the different communities in the 7 towns in Mindoro. One of the main feedback for this activity is that the elders were happy that they're able to see their own output and the output of other elders who they're familiar with, and they said it's the first time that they see their own work being shown back to them. After the validation of the documented script samples, we then proceeded with material development focusing on the graphs and the graphemic representation by identifying the variant prototypes of the script shapes. We have then selected standardized forms for each CV shape through consultation and deliberation with all of the participating elders. They have determined the standard stroke pattern across all variants and identified orthographic rules. And as usual, everything is tested afterwards. So here is the picture of elders looking at the different variants for each TV shape and trying to discuss among themselves the pros and cons of choosing a particular shape over another as their standard. Here we have another meeting with the various elders discussing the incorporation of various orthographic rules and whether they wanted to include this particular rule, they wanted a more conservative rule, or they want a more innovative rule. And as usual, every single suggestion, every single feedback is always being tested on the spot, shown back to the community, and feedback are always encouraged. After the materials development phase that focuses on graphemes and graphemic representation, the next part is still materials development, but this time focusing on storytelling and sharing. So first, the elders identified keywords for each TV shape that would allow them to recall immediately that particular CV shape or that particular concept. Identify a key illustration for this particular concept so that as soon as the child see that particular illustration, the child can associate that illustration with that particular word or concept, and that particular word and concept with a particular CV shape. The elders also shared and identified key oratures such as riddles, short story, myth, and other oral and literary genres. And then eventually, they have tried to formalize labels such as what do they call their variant of this script, what do they call the script as a whole, and eventually, after all of these discussions, the draft of the primer is built. And eventually, it is also field tested, shown back to the elders, shown back to the teachers, to the children for comments and feedback. So, what we wanted to have with this process is an increased agency, increased participation, and increased decision making involvement, not only at a community level, but also at an individual level for all the elders. So, what happened is instead of the big workflow that we have, almost every single step has an immediate validation or an immediate testing that go back to the next step that undergoes another validation and another testing before it proceeds to the next step. The output of then is basically a script primer intended for learners of Surat Hanunumo Mangyan and Surat Buhid Mangyan. So in this case, the pictures show the primer for the southern community of Buhid, which is actually interesting because for the southern Buhid community, the script they use is similar to the script used by Hanunuo and not the one traditionally used by Buhid. Historically, this is due to the differences in transmission pathways, centers of learning for the southern Buhid communities. But here you'll see that the primer has a colored cover drawn by children, colored by members of the community, and we have a default um, concept page with the key illustration, the CV shape, and the key concept, and then sample oratures, like this one of a short story. So eventually, the goal is to incorporate these materials into script teaching in either communities or in schools, the level of which will always be determined through consultation with communities. So some observations we had during both the documentation phase and the materials development phase is there is such a diversity of forms and purpose for the script. So allography is rampant, meaning different variants of each TV shape can be seen and identified across the geographic space. And there are certain functional domains that remain strong, some not that strong, but using the script as a personal signature and in Ambahan, the indigenous poem of the Mangyan, are the top two domains that maintain script use. There's also this issue about their distress with access in a sense that for the Mangyans, they have been studied for such a long time by linguists and anthropologists, and nothing comes back to the community. So in this case, when we are doing with the script documentation, there's a conscious decision by the communities to maintain the script should be restricted to members of the communities. So I myself don't know how to write the script. I just try to facilitate all these processes. There's a detachment from multi-script familiarity, so the elders usually are script masters in Surat Hanuno Mangyan and Surat Buhid Mangyan, despite a small number of elders now, know the whole set of scripts. However, biliteracy, both in the Mangyan script and the script of the lingua franca, is very uncommon. And the last point is that we're still grappling with questions on what is enough input and which is the appropriate models for script teaching, script revitalization, given the fact that these two extant Mangyan script continue to face endangerment. So one of the main themes we wanted to advocate for is sustainability. So just a brief quote. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. So basically, it's research by the community. And this is actually incorporated in part in the Philippine Development Plan for 2017 to 2022, promoting Philippine cultures and value, to value the diversity of all cultures, to inculcate values for a common good, and to advance creative excellence, and to strengthen culturally sensitive governance and development. So that's all, a list of references. Special thanks to all the elders and the communities of Hanuno and Buhid all over the island of Mindoro, and to the Mangyan Heritage Center team, Uyan, Dindo, Pinoy, Johnny, Anya, from the community, and to Per, Emily, and Chris. Acknowledgement too that this project, the documentation preservation of the Mangyan Alpha-syllabic script, is supported by the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation of the U.S. Embassy in Manila. I also like to dedicate this in memory of Chairman Paddy of Agura, Chairman Tariano of Agura, and all the other elders who have passed on while we are doing this project. Thank you. Maraming salamat. Salamat tununon, mayamo pagsalamat.
Thank you so much for this great talk. We've got quite a few questions already in the chat. So first of all, Julia, did you want to ask? I think you had a...
No, Peter's already answered that one. So go on to Peter's question.
Okay. So Peter, would you like to ask your question? This is what I'm curious about as well.
Yeah, hi Louward, it's nice to see you. My question was really about a kind of a modernistic adaptation of these scripts, you know, finding ways for them to be used expressively in modern contexts, not you know, carving on bamboo. So I just think of the example of Bye-Bye script, which is become very popular with artists and tons of tattoos, people getting tattoos. It seems to be really popular in diaspora communities also, where it's a kind of expression of, you know, identity and so on. Is there any notion of this kind of development of youth culture and the spread of the scripts in that way, in your case?
For the case of Surat Hanuno and Surat Puhid, I don't think so, because most of the discussion is predominantly dominated by what the elder wants. So, and they're usually very conservative in like the domains that they can use the script. So, tattooing is not part of that, and especially other graphic arts. And I also think that the context is quite different, because for by buying, technically, we don't have like a functional community using Baybayin in the Philippines, unlike Mangyan is still used in several of the indigenous schools. So, yeah, very different context.
Thanks. Okay, so we've then got a comment and a question from Ashley, who says, first of all, thankful and excited to see the Philippines included in this space, and would also like to know if there are ways to support this Philippines preservation work.
For Surat Hanuno Mangyan and Surat Buhid, you can visit our website. It's mangyan.org, and you can see other activities, other projects, and all of the efforts, because we work closely with the indigenous schools and like supporting the teaching of this among the communities and within formal education. So.
Louward, would you be able to put the website in the chat?
Oh, sure.
Thanks. A comment from Aris, well presented, enriching content, brilliant project. And then a question from Julia. Would you like to ask it, Julia? We've got a couple of minutes.
Well, first of all, where was I? I've got a question about whether the languages are written in any other scripts. So, so is it a question, and you say, or Peter says that the spoken languages are also endangered. I'm just worried a little bit about priorities, because, you know, according to Fishman and many other people, if you want to keep a language alive, use in the family and the community is the priority. But there is a tendency to focus on writing because that's what we as linguists are interested in. But also I was a bit worried about what you said about focusing on what the elders are interested in. And it's really important for documentation and to valorize their expertise. But is there any effort to make a link with younger people to what younger people might be interested in, because they're going to be the future owners of this? Yeah, and you already have honored people who have passed away already, and that's going to continue to happen. And the script is going to fall away with them if you don't get interest from younger people. So, for example, Peter talked about other domains. What about, you know, using, for example, mobile phones to write these scripts? Is it possible to do that? It's just basically making things that might be interesting to young people.
Okay, so let me address. There's, I think, 4 questions in that. First, the language is also written in the Roman script, like any other Philippine language. So, and the thing is, under national policy, they should be first learned in the Roman script. So they can't learn the indigenous script first before the Roman script. And second, for the vitality of the languages, since I do vitality assessment for most Philippine languages, the Mangyan languages are not that endangered in compared to like the Negrito languages of the Philippines. It's definitely lower in the scale, like probably shifting or even threatened, but not highly endangered. So orality wise, they're still in the good position because in the spoken language has more domains of use than the written form. And then for the elders and then the youth, usually when we do assemblies, like community assemblies and meetings, we mostly talk with elders first because it's part of their culture that usually the elders decide things. But when we cascade like the feedback on the materials, other decisions, and like other activities, usually there are teachers involved, children involved, and then parents involved. So it's multi-stakeholder. And then if they can use it on mobile phones, and that's one of our issues, because usually even for the materials development, one of the principles is reproducibility. So it's easier if we have a font on that. But the community doesn't want to have fonts because they think outsiders will just steal their script and they'll lose like the value of the script. So we're very cautious with like doing things they don't really like to do. So there's that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much to everyone for your questions, and thank you to our 2 fabulous presenters. So we are now going to have a break for half an hour, and please come